Hydro-Québec begins to prepare for spring flooding months in advance. The Ottawa River watershed is immense, 146,000 square kilometers. It extends from Abitibi all the way to the Montreal region, over 1,100 kilometers of water. In fact, it can take up to 3 weeks for a single drop of water to travel all that way. There are 13 main reservoirs, and Hydro-Québec owns 4 of them. These are in purple on the map. The others belong to our partners, the Ministère de l'Environnement du Québec, the Ontario Power Generation Company, and the federal government. Together, these partners are all part of the Ottawa River Regulation Planning Board, which was founded in 1983. This board allows operators of the main reservoirs to work together to manage these reservoirs, with the shared goal of minimizing impacts related to flooding. The image illustrates the major flooding recorded on the Ottawa River since 1883. Reservoirs were created up until 1954. There have been fewer major floods since then, with the exception of the flooding in 1974 and 1976, as well as in 2017 and 2019. This is because managers of the river reservoirs have worked together to keep the water in the reservoirs during the spring thaws, instead of letting it run into the rivers. This approach works, except in years of record flooding like in 2017 and 2019. The reservoirs only make it possible to control 40% of the area of the Ottawa River watershed. Flooding occurs when the quantity of water generated by snowmelt and spring rain are significant and exceed the capacity of the reservoirs in the north. The snow that melts south of our reservoirs, on 60% of the territory, cannot be held back. In fact, it is the reservoirs, not the generating stations, that hold the water back. There are 2 major types of facilities with reservoirs and run-of-the-river generating stations, like the Carillon generating station in this picture. Run-of-river generating stations cannot retain water. For example, at the peak of the 2019 flood, the flow at the Carillon generating station was nearly 9,200 cubic meters per second. That level of water was too much for the generating station's turbines to handle, so they had to open the spillway to drain the surplus. To limit the impact of the runoff, we empty our reservoirs as much as possible before the beginning of the spring thaw. We then close the gates of our facilities to hold back as much water as possible for as long as possible. We can also use the run-of-river generating stations by adjusting the opening of the gates that lead to the turbines. Then we can influence the water levels of the river. Let us look at the example of the Basketong Reservoir in 2017. Levels decreased gradually beginning in January and reached desired levels within 3 months. In early April, the reservoir began to accumulate runoff. You can see the levels increasing from April until mid-May. Now, let us look at the second figure. The dotted line shows the runoff into the reservoir, while the shaded area shows where the water flows out. We can see the amount of water flowing out of the reservoir is much less than the water amount going in. And this way, lots of water accumulates in the reservoir. Nearly all of the water in the area showed in red. Also, you can see that when the water runoff is at its maximum, in early May, lots of water, over 1,000 cubic meters per second, was held back in the reservoir. Along the same lines, each of the watershed reservoirs helps reduce the river water levels. In run-of-the-river generating stations, the water goes through the turbines. When there's too much water at once, we release water through the spillway gates. This type of generating station cannot hold back water the way a reservoir's retaining structures can. In the spring, we reduce the water levels by several centimeters to prepare for additional water during the spring runoff. On the illustration, the red line shows the backflows when flows in the river increase substantially as compared to the normal operating level represented by the black line. The yellow line shows the effect of a lowering in the water level for the populations located upstream of the structures thanks to our management of the river water levels. But if runoff is too high, as it was in 1974, 1976, 2017, and 2019, the lowering of the water level that we carry out will not be enough to avoid flooding. In April and May of this year, several episodes of heavy rainfall were recorded. Rainfall in April and May was considerable at approximately 170% of average values for this period of the year. This precipitation, in addition to the thaw of the abundant snow cover, led to historic flow in several areas of the watershed. The maximum flow in Carillon was reached on April 30th with approximately 9,200 cubic meters per second. This is the highest flow ever recorded in the history of the station. Fortunately, major floods are the exception rather than the rule and are the result of particular circumstances. We estimate that without the reservoirs, the flood peak at Carillon would have been approximately 5,000 cubic meters per second greater, with water levels considerably higher than those recorded on a major portion of the watershed. Whether spring runoff is weak or strong, our management of the reservoirs always helps reduce the severity and duration of spring floodings.